Joe Bardavilla. Welcome to another episode of the Forbes Books podcast. And leadership can be a lonely journey. Sure, being a leader of humans sounds pretty awesome, but we're not all prepared to carry that burden. Joining me today is Rick Simmons, who along with his wife Amy founded the Telos Institute. Rick and Amy's team focus on expertise, business strategy, leadership development, and change management. They're also the authors of the new book, Unleashed, that will be dropping in stores later this spring. Hello, Rick.
Hey, Joe. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. So I want to start with the name of your organization. Telos translates to with the end in mind in Greek. Obviously, I looked it up. I think it's like an Aristotle quote. Of all the names you could have given your company, why was that the message you wanted to convey?
Yeah, good question, Joe. It's really rooted in a couple of things, but I think in particular, a story that goes back many years round about the origin of the Telos Institute. I happened to be in an office tower in Manhattan working with a global 50 financial services firm amidst the financial crisis. I had a small role at the time in that room, and the management consultants were there and the binders were flying, if you will, and the CEO of that business happened to be sitting at the other end of the board table. And as they were working through the issues and the problems and navigating themselves through the financial crisis at the time, something sort of just stirred inside of me and my voice rose above the cacophony of the discussion. And I said to the CEO at the time, Martin, what are you really trying to accomplish here? And to his credit, he thoughtfully looked to his left and he thoughtfully looked to his right. And then he looked down the long conference table at me and he said, with a shuddering degree of authenticity and honesty, he said, I don't know. And in so many ways, while the Telos Institute had recently been born prior to that, it was a real validating story around this idea that so fundamentally, it's often so important to just start with what are we really trying to accomplish here? And we sometimes turn that into a grandiose question, but it can be as simple and as localized as in this meeting, what are we really trying to do here? And that in and of itself makes for an interesting story, but to see then over the next hour, how that realization then allowed the folks in the room to redirect their energy, to redeploy their focus and come out of that room with a set of tasks and clearly charged with what needed to happen next was a real validating point in and a reason for why the name the Telos Institute is really important to us.
What does that mean in terms of the Institute? So I get what sort of like the eureka moment that you had in that office in New York City. But so what does that mean with the Telos Institute?
Yeah, so the institute, the word institute was, Joe, really deliberate on, I think, two dimensions. The first one was we wanted Telos to be a place that supported a growing body of knowledge, that through our work, we would not only deliver transformational experiences for our clients, but that we would be a learning organization, that through that work, each engagement would build upon what we know collectively and be able to continue to improve in an ongoing way in the work that we do with clients. So, really sort of embodying that institute, word, that more traditional sense of what an institute is, a growing body of knowledge, seeding a ongoing learning.
So in other words, you didn't want it to be like Telos Consulting or Telos Core. You wanted it to be for the really bare minimum kind of thing, like almost as a schooling or a place of education.
Yeah, and that it implied an intellectual rigor in what we're doing here that is not a sort of a passive delivery of services, but an ongoing assessment of the quality of what we do and not just building off past knowledge, but real time building insights about how we can support leaders and organizations and teams around the world. And I would just say the other sort of for us, the serendipity of this was that institute is also a verb. And so delivering insights, sharing our knowledge about how teams work together effectively or about how leaders lead best, just talking about that is not the measure of a Telos engagement. Applying that learning, implementing that learning, or really bringing the verb and instituting what is being discussed and talked about, or awareness that is brought to a leader, is an indispensable part of what we do and really the standard by which we evaluate all of our engagements.
And pardon me if this comes off weird, but it is a very grandiose mission. Is it difficult to educate people on what the Telos Institute does? Because it sounds amazing, yet if I'm like this old school entrepreneur who knows about KPIs and OKRs, again, pardon me, is this like a tough sell, or is this something that people in the industries you work with, they're hyper aware of?
It's a fair point, Joe. It's a fair question, and I will say two things. People don't talk like that,
Yeah.
and we do. And I think what we have found by talking like that is that people want to talk like that.
Hmm.
They believe in places that they don't talk about at cocktail parties, that there is another level within themselves. There is more within their team if only someone would bring that topic to an explicit level. We're that mechanism for doing that. Now, truth be told, not everybody wants to talk that way. And if that's not the case, then we're not for you.
So in other words, you don't have a big sales presentation where you're trying to really get, hey, listen, this is really important to you, and the person's like, nah, I'm not having it. You're not too worried about that prospective client, right?
Yeah, I got out of the selling business a long time ago, Joe.
Yeah.
And we have built an organization on levying invitations to people, rooted in a belief that there is greatness within each and every one of them, but offering only an invitation, not a requirement to help them find that next level within them.
And there's a phrase that you use that I wasn't aware of until prior to this conversation, and that's liminal space. It sounds like something out of a Michael Crichton novel, to be honest with you. So can you describe what this liminal space is?
Yeah, and I sort of the classic retort to that is, can you spell that for me, Rick? Right?
Right.
So liminal space is essentially, by definition, a word, liminal itself, that means betwixt and between. It's this notion of a threshold. There was what we knew to be true yesterday, Joe. There is a sense of what will be true tomorrow, and then there's this space in between. We believe, and I think each of us can source our own examples to support this belief, that these periods of discontinuity and disruption create disproportionate opportunities for change. We believe that the ability to drive change is not democratically equal every day of every moment throughout, a year or a decade. Like Tuesday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon isn't necessarily equally as right for driving change as, Thursday at 9 a.m. Right? There's these moments in our individual and collective trajectories that create opportunities to drive change more significantly and more sustainably than others. That is how we think of liminal space.
And this is kind of a weird question, but the Telos Institute and the work you guys doing sounds like of the moment. Sounds like this exists in this time. Could a Telos Institute have been around or flourished in like the 1980s or 1970s? Or is it just because the Telos Institute and your mission is something that could only happen in this time and now?
That's a good question. I think, in many ways, the idea of serving as a trusted advisor, a quiet, discreet source of support and feedback and truth telling, which is often the role that we play with leaders and leadership teams, has been around a long time, and it's taken on many different forms. Now, I will say that over the last 20 or 30 years, we've been deluged with the notion of one's why. The literature is filled with passages about the why of your existence being important, and we agree with that. There's bookshelves filled with, how you show up as a leader and as a team, and the importance of that, and we would agree with that. But I think the evolution of those topics have led us to where we're at now, to your point, which is when you or your team are at these periods of inflection is equally as important as cataloging why you exist and how you show up. But being aware of when you're at these points of inflection is equally as important. And I think it's become what's next.
Rick, one of my favorite quotes of yours is, the success of your organization is directly related to the quality and character of those involved. We live in a black and white world where that's results driven. How can a company that's driven by results and also surround itself with quality and character? Are they mutually exclusive? Because we're afraid to share information with people because you don't want to offend someone, or you're afraid to say something that's out of bounds. You don't want to have people like that in your organization, but they drive results. So how do you come up with this common ground where it all meshes together?
Yeah, another good question, Joe. I think that out of expediency, we have allowed ourselves to believe that some of these things are competing concepts. One of the things that we try to hold close is this idea, and within our own organization and as a guide for our interaction with our clients, is that honesty is more important than the relationship, because without it, there isn't one. So that may sound counter. Well, Rick, if you're too honest, maybe that puts the relationship at risk. And we would say that the more honest, with love in our heart and with respect always, of course, that ability and that choice to be honest with one another actually honors and acknowledges the greatness within you, Joe, or myself, or Amy, or anyone else, and raises that to an accountable level.
Hmm.
And so that ability and willingness to be honest is an expression of character.
You mentioned the fact that you don't sell anymore. You stopped
Mm.
selling a long time ago. But is there a way to show a ROI, to to use one of these acronyms that people love these days? Is there an ROI when it comes to executive level coaching in professional service organizations? Or is it just sort of a very mystical kind of answer to that?
Yeah. So, and it's a fair question. Joe, I actually, my graduate thesis was the return on investment of executive level coaching in professional service organizations. So I'm keenly attuned to the responsibilities that CEOs and CFOs and leaders of all kinds have in organizations, to the investments that they make, whether they be in technology or machinery or people or whatever that is. So it's an inbounds question, and I will say this, that we begin each of our engagements with a question about that very topic. What would be the metric or set of metrics that your organization, Joe, would want to use to measure the efficacy or the degree of impact that we can have in your organization? Now, they'll often say, well, boy, I don't know, Rick, do you have some ideas? Of course, we've seen that, and we can bring it. But we like to start that with an acknowledgement that it may look different in ABC company than it would in XYZ company. And so that dialogue around what would those metrics be, or how would it manifest itself in your organization, is an important one for us. And again, we're not flat-footed in being able to come to the table and say, rates of retention, or the number of participants in the Leadership Academy program that we've been running for the last 5 years in your organization has yielded 70% of those participants as having been promoted to senior levels in the organization. So there's a lot of different quality and quantity measures that we can bring to the table. Probably too many to get into it in depth here, but there are ways to measure that efficacy.
And, you founded the Institute to help leaders in business and industry evolve strategy and change management skills and become more effective leaders. So if you don't mind, could we see how you do that? Like, can we play pretend that I'm like a CEO of a company and I'd love to work with the Telos Institute? How could you do that in just a few moments' time, if that's possible?
Yeah, there's some simple fundamental questions that we'll often ask early on in the life cycle of an engagement. And a couple of those questions are rooted in our comments earlier. What, as a leader, are you really trying to accomplish here? I will tell you, it is easy to lose one's way when you're leading at the top. And simply coming into the room with a leader and asking some of those simple questions about what is the organization really trying to accomplish here, more times than not, people don't have answers for that, Joe.
Hmm.
And so that isn't certainly the sum total of how we would engage with a client, but there's some really simple fundamental questions like that can be transformational.
It's funny, Rick, because you say that and you're probably speaking to Generation X or millennial executives. who believe in mission statements and they have something, put up on their bulletin board in the office or something like that. But at the end of the day, they still don't have that mission. Like they have something written on a piece of paper, but they don't know what it means. It's almost like we've gotten to a point where, hey, you've got to have one of these things. It's sort of like you've got to have a shirt and tie. You've got to have a mission statement. Are you seeing that where there are people kind of get it but don't get it?
Yes, and let me expand on that a little bit, Joe. I think that more practically, and even to your previous question, I think we have a framework that we have over the last 15 years adopted that each of the pillars of this framework, when working together, really predict a well-oiled organizational machine. And those pillars line up this way. Really, it really, to your point, starts with purpose and having a clear sense of reason for being that permeates throughout the organization, right? It doesn't just hang on a wall in a conference room. You can walk on the shop floor and ask somebody that fundamental question and they can articulate it, right? So it's our reason for being and really that purpose piece. And then more practically, helping leaders understand, how do we align our people elements, the right people in the right seats, clear about the task that they're doing, clear about how that contributes to the larger organizational goal. Products, exploring that third component, purpose first, people second. Products are the things that we're in the business to deliver. Are we fully in those businesses? So many times we walk in the room and an organization has 1,000 SKUs or 1,000 different things they sell, but really only a dozen of them are they really all in on. And so do the other 900 plus really serve their end? And pruning that portfolio is often part of the work that we do, and helping them choose and discern which of those elements to keep and drop down. Process. I've long believed the secret to success is a system. And so helping an organization or a leader or a leadership team really get clear about the rhythm and the cadence by which that organization operates. I will often say to a leader, I'll say, does your organization run like this? Does it run like this? Or optimally, would you like it to run like this? Right? And as a leader, we have more influence than we might like to admit about the tempo that we set for our organizations. If it's too fast, it burns out quickly. If it's too slow, it doesn't adapt quickly enough. So finding that right rhythm and tempo and the process that we utilize in an organization is essential. And then lastly, I'll say, Joe, that performance is a key element in any business. And so, what are the things that we're tracking and measuring? Because the things that we're tracking and measuring say an awful lot about what's important to us as an organization. And a lot of the organizations we walk into simply track and measure what they track and measure because it's what they tracked and measured yesterday. So giving them a chance and a forum to be thoughtful about what they're going to track and measure tomorrow is often a big part of what we do and how we can help.
I'm curious, Rick, when did this shift take place? I joked earlier, the back in the old days, olden times, entrepreneurs just cared about making money, and then eventually you saw this shift where, especially when it came to major corporations having a mission to their company. What do you know when this happened? Like, was this, is this relatively recent, or was there maybe less like a jumping point where this was like, oh, corporate America or maybe even corporations across the world were like, we need to have a mission?
Yeah, Joe, I can't recite the date and time on the calendar when that happened. I'm not sure anyone can. I will say this though, from personal experience, I do remember as an undergraduate finance student, I remember looking at a simple formula, the cost of goods sold formula that identifies, the major components to producing a product or delivering a service. And at that time, and it's still true today, the largest component of the cost of goods sold equation is labor. And in the last 30 years, we have optimized other components of that cost of goods sold model, like the supply chain, and we've infused degrees of technology that have lowered costs and shortened delivery times. But but labor is still the largest component. I remember even as an undergraduate student thinking, how might we optimize that? The person or the firm that can figure out how to optimize that jumps everybody in line. And so I don't know exactly when that happened. I will tell you it's part of when it happened for me.
Hmm.
And I think that there's been a growing shift in that direction as we've all sort of collectively realized that as you optimize those other ingredients in that equation, it still leaves labor as the largest component and such a necessary and rich opportunity to get that right.
And does your methodology, your institute, help in or work with all cultures? And the reason I bring this up is I just finished reading the Reed Hastings Netflix book,
Mhm.
and he talks about this culture they created. And I think they have a sign up in the office that says something like "adequate performance will be rewarded with a hearty severance pay" or something like that. So I screwed up the quote, but basically, if you do a good job, you get fired. You have to do a great job to stay there. So does your methodology work whether it's a cutthroat company or cutthroat industry, or does it work everywhere?
Joe, I'll distinguish this in a couple of ways. We are thoughtful about aligning our values with the values of the organizations that we deal with. Alignment doesn't mean symmetrical or identical, right? It means that there is cohesiveness in those values. And so what I'll say is there have been instances where we have turned down pieces of work because we didn't feel like there was a values alignment. Now, what does that mean? Values alignment for us includes things like appreciative, strengths based. There's famously a story in our organization where a financially lucrative opportunity came about for us, but it was a solidly deficit based thinking organization. And
Well,
while that's not
what you mean by that, Rick?
yeah, so it was a gotcha culture.
Oh,
And so if you missed a period or a comma, no matter how long your contribution may have been, you were sort of out.
hmm.
And so we haven't said no to all of those opportunities because we think that there's an opportunity to inject a new way of thinking, a new way of being that they may just not have been exposed to. But if that culture is so deeply ingrained, there have been minor instances where we've chosen not to engage. But to answer your question, I think that by and large, people, as I mentioned, earlier, people want and are open to new ways of thinking. They want to explore how their culture can continue to evolve. And so it's not our job to change a culture when we go in there, but it is our job to challenge the process and to spark their thinking and to give them the tools, the resources, and the awareness to evolve that culture in a way that of their choosing.
And obviously you're the expert in this field, but I wonder, do companies need to be, and this is what I'm thinking, speaking to you and you're sharing these anecdotes with me, do companies need to be all in for this to work? Like, do they have to be all into Telos Institute and what you guys have devised, in tandem with the company? Because I always feel like, there's a lot of different personalities in every company. So does everybody have to be on board for it to work, or like can the COO be like, I don't buy this, or maybe there's like the CFO's like, I don't think this is going to help us in the long run. Talk to me about that dynamic, about the all-in nature of this sort of venture.
We can't get 100% of people to agree to just about anything in this world, Joe. So,
That's the question.
so I think it would be a non-starter for us if 100% sort of adaptation was required. Look, I think that there are pockets of ambition and aspiration that live inside an organization, and we can start there and build.
Hmm.
And we have some really precious video. We did an engagement with a large, well-known manufacturing company in this country, globally footprinted, and the CFO of that business provided the quintessential eye roll as we were kicking off this this piece of work. And truth be told, in that moment, there was some concern on our part because there are folks in organizations like that can be derailers.
Hmm.
And to see many months later this same person on camera extolling the value of the process. He was the classic reformed participant, right? And
Yeah.
so we don't go looking for those kinds of situations, but we have learned to trust the process.
Hmm.
and to believe that those pockets of hope and aspiration and inspiration do live in an organization, and they live within each of us as well. And we take our role seriously to light a spark to that.
Hmm. And if running a company wasn't hard enough, whether it's a recession or a market crash, here comes March 2020 and a global pandemic affects everyone. First, let's start with Telos Institute. What were some of your initial thoughts on what you guys were going to do internally?
Yeah. So, good or bad, right or wrong, we had finished by a long shot our best year ever commercially as an organization in 2019. So our ambitions were fully stoked. Our sights were set appropriately high,
Hmm.
and so as the news started to trickle in, and we have a colleague of ours who is an American and lived the early part of his life here in the United States, but he's now based in Vietnam. And as he was starting to share, that his children had been out of school for had been 8, 9, 10 weeks, it started to dawn on me. Wait a minute, this is not going away,
Hmm.
and we really have to get our heads about us and start playing the long game on this. And so, Joe, if you would have told me a year ago that it would last this long and it would cut this deep, I would have been very concerned. In many ways, for some companies, we're a discretionary spend,
Mm-hmm.
and so I did have some concern about that. And the business has shown itself to be far more durable than I would have guessed. I think that in the midst of disruption, in this unpredictable environment, people have turned to the Telos Institute as a source of advice and guidance and counsel. And we have been fully declarative with our clients and prospects that we don't need a scope of work to help our friends when the stakes are highest. And we have made that real. We have made that true. And it may not make our next quarter, Joe,
Mm-hmm.
but it's going to make our next decade.
Hmm. And so let's now face it outwardly. Did you have to change any of your engagements or focuses in terms of how you were dealing with companies and executing your plan with them? Were there any kind of, I hate to use this word because it was used so much in 2020, but pivot on some of the, like if the pandemic hadn't happened, you would do something different with this particular engagement that you were working on?
Yeah, well, if you'll allow me, I'll share a quick story that speaks to that a bit. We have a large hospital system in Central Florida that is a client of ours, and we had just teed up the next iteration of some really fun and meaningful and system-wide work that we would do with them that had built on some work that we had done the previous year, and we were all really excited, them, to launch into the next iteration of this. And my colleague received a phone call, and the client had called and said that, yeah, the work that we had teed up, that's not going to happen, and the sizable down payment they had made on that work, they were going to need that back.
Oof.
We had a fair amount of internal dialogue about that, Joe, and the more we thought about it, and the more we thought about it, not through the lens of what's right or good or most beneficial for the Telos Institute, but we thought about it through the lens of what's right and what's most beneficial for our client. The answer was no. We're not going to return that check, and we are going to reimagine how we can put that money to work. Because if there's any population in America a year ago and since that needs support, it's healthcare workers, frontline healthcare workers. And we went back to the client and said, no, we're not going to allow you to behave in a way that you're not going to feel good about a year from now. And their response was, you're 100% right.
Wow. Going into that, Rick, what were your feelings? Were you like, this would go 50-50? I mean, what were you thinking internally when you were ready to present that to them?
I was scared. I was scared. I was certainly questioning. This is either the best decision we'll have made as an organization, or maybe the worst.
Wow.
But Joe, I just kept every time I got in that ping pong dialogue in my head, quietly in my head, I kept coming back to the question: what's in the best interest of our client.
Hmm.
And I just continue to say that our role as a trusted advisor to this organization has got to be at all times to be a truth teller, to be a source of alternate thinking, perspective, and sometimes hard feedback. And it felt like all of those came into play in that discussion, and I was willing to win or lose regardless of their response.
Wow. You're in such a tough spot because essentially you're an entrepreneurial venture working with other entrepreneurial ventures. So it's sometimes doesn't the two things don't sometimes match in terms of scope because, something like that, they could have just been like, yeah, no, listen, it's all about the money for us. We don't care about what's going on there. So it obviously could have gone either way. But the fact that you were able to get the message right to them and be like, hey, listen, it's not about this check you wrote and want your money back. It's like, what's best for you? And at the end of the day, it turned out to be best for both of you.
Yeah. True enough, Joe. And I will say that part of why the space existed for us to share that message is because my colleagues here at the Telos Institute modeled that every day in our interactions with this organization. So showing up in that way at that moment, while high stakes and certainly highly visible, really wasn't any different than how, my colleague Wendy Blazak and her team within our organization had interacted with that organization from day one. So I think, it's sort of easy to fixate on that high stakes moment, but it was every interaction in the years before that that created the crease and the crevice for us to be able to have that tough conversation.
Hmm. And lastly, you know leadership and how it works. How do you think, super broad strokes question here, Rick, and you can answer it which way you want. How do you think our leaders handled 2020 and the pandemic in general terms, whether it's on the corporate level, government level? What leaders stood out to you in terms of the way they handled the past year?
First of all, let me say that this was a super challenging environment for everyone.
Mm.
Whether you sat in a seat of influence, directly or indirectly, to how this situation played out, we've all been affected. We've all been imposed upon and have explicitly or implicitly had to deal with everything that has gone on around us. So I honor and acknowledge that in situations like this, I really do believe we're all doing the very best we can.
Mm.
Now, that doesn't mean we're all equally effectively responding to those situations. I think some have shown themselves to be able to transcend above and others not. I think those that have been able to transcend have provided high levels of communication. They've maintained appropriate levels of connectivity with their stakeholders, and they've provided to the greatest degree possible clarity
Mm.
for them. People are unwilling to change or move forward until they know what won't change. And the best leaders I've seen were highly communicative, maintained connectivity with their stakeholders, and created as much clarity and certainty as they could for those different stakeholder groups. And the leaders that didn't communicate consistently or clearly, didn't maintain a degree of connectivity with their stakeholders,
Mm.
and provided little or no clarity about how we were going to move forward, I think did less well than those that did.
Hmm. I think, it's funny. Again, you're the expert in this, but I always feel like regardless of what the outcome was, the leaders that showed the most empathy, whether they were successful or not, I think to the masses appeared successful. Like if you just showed you cared a little bit, no matter how you ran the company, whether it was horribly or not, whether you made mistakes without naming them, if you showed some sort of empathy and it was authentic to people, whether it's your employee or someone on the outside, I think that's what a lot of the best leaders did. They just showed empathy and they cared. And maybe that's something that you're probably more attuned to than I am, but I think we're lacking empathy in a lot of places last year. And every time you saw it, you're like, oh my God, that's what that feels like. That's what that looks like.
Yeah, it's such a keen observation, Joe. I 100% agree. And not only does it just intuitively feel right, the science would suggest that, in the world of sort of change and progress, what we know to be indisputably true is that moving humans forward, human systems forward, always has to start with a healthy dose of empathy, because the opposite of that is indictment. And so no one moves off of center if they're feeling indicted or unappreciated or judged in any way. If and by the way, I'm hearing you right in saying that empathy doesn't have to mean agreement,
Right.
but we just understand how we got here, how we're feeling now that we are here, and from that basis, you're so right. All good things sort of dovetail off of that foundation of empathy.
Hmm. His name is Rick Simmons. He's the co-founder of the Telos Institute. Rick, I could talk to you all day about this stuff, but I'm going to let you go. Thank you very much for showing up on the podcast.
Thank you, Joe. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
And to find out more about what Rick and Amy do, check out thetelosinstitute.com and be on the lookout for their new book, Unleashed, Harnessing the Power of Liminal Space, in stores this spring. And that's it for this edition of the Forbes Books Podcast, available for you to listen to and subscribe to on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please, don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.
This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio. Find out more at ForbesBooksRadio.com.